The man they buried was never dead. That isn't a metaphor. It is an exaggeration. And it isn't something investigators realized right away. Mark Delaney had a funeral, a real one. There were floral arrangements lining the chapel walls, folded programs with his photo printed in black and white, family members seated in silence, absorbing a loss that felt sudden and irreversible. The state of Florida issued an official death certificate. The legal system accepted it, and dozens of people walked away believing the nightmare was finally over. But Mark Delaney didn't disappear to escape prison. He disappeared because prison wasn't the worst thing waiting for him. To understand why, you have to go back to the final days before he vanished. October 2013, Cape Coral, Florida. On the surface, Mark Delaney looked like the kind of man people trusted instinctively. Early 40s, well-groomed, calm voice, the type who shook hands firmly and remembered your kids' names. He was deeply embedded in the community, church events, local business mixers, neighborhood cookouts. When Mark talked about real estate, people listened, because he spoke with confidence and certainty, and he made wealth sound not just achievable but inevitable. That confidence had built him an empire, and then it destroyed him. Behind closed doors, investigators were unraveling a web of lies. Fake renovation projects, shell companies that led nowhere, falsified profit statements, and investor funds quietly redirected into accounts Mark controlled. Millions of dollars had vanished. Retirees lost their life savings. Parents lost college funds. Entire families were financially gutted. Even Mark's own brother had invested and lost nearly everything. By mid-October, prosecutors were ready. Mark Delaney was days away from standing trial for large-scale real estate fraud. If convicted, he faced decades behind bars. His reputation was already in ruins. His wife had moved out. Friends had stopped answering his calls. And then, without warning, Mark vanished. Early one morning, police received a report of an abandoned car near the Caloosahatchee River. When officers arrived, something about the scene felt unsettlingly deliberate. The car sat at an angle near the embankment, hazard lights blinking. The driver's door was open as if someone had stepped out briefly, planning to return. Inside the vehicle, nothing appeared stolen or disturbed. Mark's wallet was there, cash untouched. His smartphone lay cracked but dry, tossed onto the passenger seat. In the cup holder, a half-full cup of coffee had gone cold. And just beyond the car, at the river's edge, officers found the detail that would define the case. A pair of brown loafers. Clean, expensive, placed neatly side by side. The message was clear without a single word being written. Mark Delaney had walked into the river. Search efforts escalated quickly. The Caloosahatchee was known for its unpredictable currents and limited visibility. If someone entered the water intentionally, survival was unlikely. Divers searched relentlessly. Boats dragged the river. Helicopters scanned the surface for any sign of a body. Hours passed, then days. Nothing surfaced. Media outlets framed the story as a tragic but understandable end to a disgraced man's life. A suicide driven by shame. A final escape from accountability. Eventually, officials made the call. Mark Delaney was presumed dead. And just like that, everything changed. The trial was dismissed. The charges dissolved. Years of investigation came to a halt. Not because Mark had been proven innocent, but because the court system no longer had a living defendant. For his victims, justice evaporated overnight. Some attended the funeral. Some refused. Some felt anger. Others felt relief. But all of them were left without answers or restitution. Mark's wife filed insurance claims. The payout was substantial. His name was quietly entered into public records as deceased. And life moved on, for most people, but not for everyone. One detective, quiet, methodical, and deeply uncomfortable with coincidences, kept replaying the scene in his mind. Because Mark Delaney was a planner. He planned business deals months in advance. He planned conversations. He planned contingencies. This was not a man who acted impulsively. And suicide didn't fit the pattern. Neither did the details. The phone was smashed, but not wet. The wallet was left behind, cash included. There was no note, no farewell message, no explanation. And the shoes? Why remove your shoes before entering a river? Weeks later, inconsistencies began to surface. A private bank account, one prosecutors hadn't uncovered, had been drained just days before Mark's disappearance. A storage unit rented under a different name was found empty, abandoned shortly after the funeral. And then there was the tip. An anonymous caller claimed to have seen a man matching Mark Delaney's description at a gas station nearly 40 miles away. After the river search had already begun, the tip went nowhere. Officials chalked it up to grief, mistaken identity, or attention-seeking. The case was closed. Mark Delaney was dead, except he wasn't, because what no one realized at the time was this. Mark Delaney hadn't walked into that river to die. He had stepped into it briefly, to sell a story. A story that relied on one thing above all else. Once the world believed he was dead, no one would look for a living man. For years the lie held. No one searched. No one questioned. No one imagined he was still out there, breathing, working, watching. But 4 years later, in a completely different state, one routine action would expose everything. A single mistake would shatter the illusion, and when investigators reopened the case, they would discover something far more disturbing than fraud. Because Mark Delaney hadn't just erased himself to escape justice. He had erased himself because something else was closing in. And when police finally realized the man they buried was alive, they uncovered evidence suggesting Mark Delaney wasn't just a con artist. He was hiding from a truth far darker than prison. If this story has you questioning how easily someone can vanish, hit the like button, comment, and subscribe. Because the next part of the story reveals a moment investigators realized they'd been played, and what they found next changed everything. For years had passed since Mark Delaney was pronounced dead. For years since the river, the shoes, the funeral. For years since the legal system closed the file and moved on. And then, quietly without warning, the lie cracked. It didn't happen during a dramatic raid or a tip from an informant. It happened in the most ordinary place imaginable. A hospital. Late summer, 2017. Flagstaff, Arizona. A man was brought into the emergency room just after midnight, dehydrated, disoriented, a fractured wrist from what he claimed was a hiking accident. He was sunburned, underweight, and clearly exhausted. He gave the intake nurse a name. Michael Stone. No driver's license. No insurance card. No emergency contact. That wasn't unusual. But protocol required one extra step when a patient arrived without identification. Fingerprints. The nurse expected nothing. Just another nameless patient who would be treated and discharged. Instead, the system froze. Then it chimed. A silent alert appeared on the screen. One the nurse didn't fully understand, but knew meant trouble. Those fingerprints didn't belong to Michael Stone. They belonged to Mark Delaney, legally deceased, presumed drowned, buried 4 years earlier in Florida. Within hours, federal authorities were notified. And just like that, a man the world believed was dead was suddenly very much alive and very exposed. Agents moved carefully, quietly. They didn't confront him right away. They watched, confirmed, cross-checked. The man calling himself Michael Stone had been living off the grid, cash-only jobs, short-term rentals, no social media, no digital footprint worth tracing. He moved often, changed his appearance subtly, never stayed long enough to become memorable. This wasn't the life of a panicked fugitive. It was the life of someone who had practiced disappearing. When agents finally approached him, Mark didn't run. He didn't panic. According to those present, he looked almost relieved. When they asked him his name, he smiled faintly and said nothing. When they told him they knew who he was, he didn't deny it. Instead, he leaned back and asked a single question. How long did it take you? The answer, for years, only made him smile wider. Mark Delaney was taken into custody without resistance and extradited back to Florida. But reopening the case wasn't as simple as arresting a man who had faked his death. Investigators now had a much bigger problem, because Mark hadn't just evaded trial. He had one time to destroy evidence, time to erase connections, time to let memories fade. And as detectives began reconstructing the years he'd been dead, a disturbing pattern emerged. Mark hadn't been hiding in fear. He had been living deliberately. Financial records showed that shortly before his disappearance, Mark had transferred money into accounts tied to identities investigators hadn't known existed. Those identities had since been used to rent apartments, purchase vehicles, and even open small businesses. He wasn't surviving. He was operating. But what truly unsettled investigators wasn't how well Mark had vanished. It was why. Because as the fraud case was re-examined, something surfaced that had never been fully explored. Two witnesses, both former associates, both central to the prosecution's original case, both prepared to testify against Mark Delaney, and both dead. The first had died in what was ruled a single-car accident months before Mark's disappearance. The second was found unresponsive in his home weeks later, death attributed to natural causes. At the time, no one connected the dots. Now, detectives couldn't ignore them. When Mark had vanished, those deaths had been footnotes. Now they felt like warnings. Investigators pulled phone records, travel logs, old emails. What they found was troubling. In the months leading up to Mark's disappearance, he had contacted both men repeatedly. Conversations had grown tense, heated, urgent. One email stood out. It wasn't a threat. It was a plea. Mark wrote that if the truth came out, it wouldn't end with prison. He never explained what he meant. At the time, prosecutors assumed it was desperation. Now they weren't so sure. When Mark was questioned about the witnesses, he didn't deny knowing them. He didn't deny the arguments. But when asked directly if he had anything to do with their deaths, he laughed softly and said, "You're asking the wrong question." The room went quiet. "What you should be asking," he continued, "is why I knew I wouldn't survive a trial." That sentence changed everything. Investigators realized Mark hadn't faked his death because he thought he'd lose in court. He faked his death because he believed testifying, really testifying, would put his life in danger. From whom? That was the mystery no one could answer. As the fraud charges were reinstated, prosecutors added new counts: insurance fraud, identity theft, obstruction of justice. But something was missing. Motive. Mark Delaney had gone to extraordinary lengths to disappear. He had studied currents, staged a scene, manipulated the legal system, and lived as a ghost for years. People don't do that for money alone. And then came the final discovery. While combing through old case files, an investigator found a sealed document, never entered into evidence, never followed up on. It was a statement from a third witness, someone who had agreed to cooperate, and then abruptly backed out days before Mark's disappearance. The reason given? Fear. The witness claimed Mark wasn't the one pulling the strings. He claimed Mark was the one trying to get out. The document ended with one line that sent a chill through the room. If he testifies, he won't live long enough to hear the verdict. Suddenly, Mark's words made sense. Prison hadn't been the worst thing waiting for him. Testifying was. And when prosecutors finally forced Mark Delaney to explain what he knew, he revealed a secret so dangerous that faking his own death had been the only way to stay alive. Like, comment, and subscribe, because the last part of the story exposes a truth Mark buried deeper than his own fake grave, and why some questions were never meant to be answered. By the time Mark Delaney stood in a Florida courtroom again, he was no longer pretending to be dead, but he wasn't telling the truth either. He looked different now. Older, thinner, the confidence dulled but not gone. The man who once sold dreams of wealth now spoke carefully, choosing words like someone defusing a bomb. Because in his mind, that's exactly what he was doing. Prosecutors expected defiance, denial, maybe arrogance. What they didn't expect was fear. Real fear. When Mark finally agreed to speak, off the record at first, he made one thing clear. "I didn't fake my death to escape prison," he said. "I faked it to stay alive." That claim forced investigators to confront a terrifying possibility. What if Mark Delaney wasn't the architect of the entire fraud? What if he was a middleman who knew too much? As the case expanded beyond financial crimes, federal authorities quietly brought in additional agencies. Records that had once seemed unrelated were suddenly reviewed together. Property deals, offshore transfers, shell companies, political donations. Patterns emerged. Mark hadn't been operating alone. Money flowed through his accounts, but it didn't stay there. It moved quickly, layered, laundered, rerouted into entities far more sophisticated than anything Mark had created himself. When investigators asked who was on the other end, Mark went silent. Then he asked for guarantees. Not immunity, not reduced charges. Protection. That was the moment prosecutors understood the stakes. Mark Delaney wasn't bargaining like a criminal trying to shave years off a sentence. He was bargaining like a witness who believed talking could get him killed. Under oath, Mark finally explained the choice he'd made years earlier. Testifying wouldn't just expose fraud. It would expose people who didn't end up in courtrooms. People who didn't leave paper trails. People who solved problems quietly. According to Mark, the two witnesses who had died before his disappearance weren't coincidences. They were warnings. After the second death, Mark claimed he received a message, short, indirect, unmistakable. Trials bring attention. Attention brings risk, and risk gets handled. He was told, without being told, that if he took the stand, the river wouldn't be necessary. So he did the only thing he believed would buy him time. He erased himself. Investigators verified pieces of his story. Not everything, but enough to be deeply unsettling. Financial records tied to international accounts. Connections to figures who had never appeared in Mark's original case file. And yet, there was a problem. No matter how dangerous the truth sounded, Mark had still committed crimes. Serious ones. Faking his death hadn't made him innocent. It had made him a fugitive. The government faced a dilemma. Expose a larger, shadowy network, risking lives and collapsing cases they couldn't fully prove? Or focus on the man in front of them, the one who lied, stole, and manipulated everyone he touched? In the end, they chose certainty. Mark Delaney was charged again, this time with wire fraud, identity theft, insurance fraud, and obstruction of justice. In court, he listened as victims testified about losing homes, retirements, marriages. He heard how his disappearance had robbed them not just of money, but of closure. When it was his turn to speak, Mark didn't apologize. He didn't explain himself. He only said this: "You think disappearing was about freedom. It wasn't. It was about survival." The jury deliberated for less than a day. Guilty on all counts. Mark Delaney was sentenced to 34 years in federal prison. As marshals led him away, reporters shouted questions. Was it worth it? Who were you running from? Do you regret faking your death? Mark turned briefly, and for the first time, his confidence returned. "I regret thinking the truth would ever matter," he said. Then he was gone. Officially, the story ended there. The fraud case closed. The conviction secured. Justice, at least on paper, served. But not everything was resolved. The deaths of the two witnesses were never reopened. No new charges were filed. No public connections drawn. The sealed documents remained sealed. And some investigators involved in the case would later admit, off the record, that certain leads were quietly abandoned. Too complex. Too dangerous. Too costly. Mark Delaney entered prison as a convicted fraudster, but he carried something else with him. Knowledge. Knowledge of how easily systems can be manipulated, of how death, real or staged, can silence questions, and of how some truths are buried not because they're false, but because they're inconvenient. Years later, one detective reflected on the case and said this: "We proved he faked his death. We proved he committed fraud, but we never proved he was lying about why. And that's what makes this case so unsettling, because Mark Delaney didn't just fake his death. He exposed how fragile certainty really is. So here's the question that still lingers. Was Mark Delaney a criminal inventing fear to excuse his actions? Or was he a man who knew too much and chose a fake grave over a real one? And if he hadn't made that choice, would he have lived long enough to be sentenced? If this story made you question how much truth ever reaches the surface, like this video, share your thoughts and comments, and subscribe, because the most dangerous crimes aren't always the ones we solve. They're the ones we quietly stop asking questions about.